ancient world, when a warrior fell in battle, his story ended. But for his wife back home in Sparta, the nightmare was just beginning. What happened next would make death seem like a mercy. Most people know Sparta as the legendary military powerhouse of ancient Greece, famous for the Battle of Thermopylae and warriors who would rather die than surrender. We've been told stories of honor, courage, and the famous Spartan motto, "Come back with your shield or on it." But this untold history reveals a darker truth that historians have long struggled to fully document. Behind the bronze shields and red cloaks lay a systematic cruelty that targeted the most innocent victims of military defeat. When I think about ancient warfare, I usually focus on the battlefield. But in Sparta, the real war began after the fighting stopped. The Spartan state had engineered something more terrifying than death itself. A living punishment that could destroy not just a warrior, but everyone connected to him. This wasn't random cruelty born from anger or grief. This was calculated social engineering, designed to weaponize shame and create a fear so powerful that warriors would choose certain death over the possibility of subjecting their loved ones to what came next. The system worked like this. When news reached Sparta that a warrior had shown cowardice, fled from battle, or worst of all, surrendered to the enemy, his wife instantly became something less than human in the eyes of society. She transformed from a respected citizen into a walking symbol of failure, a cautionary tale made flesh. But what makes this history mystery even more chilling is that these women had committed no crime themselves. Their only mistake was loving men who had failed to meet Sparta's impossible standards. Yet, in a society where collective punishment was considered natural justice, individual innocence meant absolutely nothing. Imagine being a Spartan wife going about your daily routine when a messenger arrives at your door. In that instant, before you even hear the words, you can see it in their eyes. Your husband is alive, but something worse than death has occurred. The transformation was immediate and absolute. The respect you once commanded vanished like morning mist. The neighbors who greeted you warmly now crossed the street to avoid you. Friends disappeared overnight. Even family members distanced themselves, terrified that association with you might spread the contamination of dishonor to their own households. This wasn't casual social awkwardness. This was mandated ostracism, enforced by both law and custom. Historical accounts from ancient writers paint scenes of systematic dehumanization that would horrify even hardened soldiers. These women were stripped of their status as citizens and wives, relegated to a shadowy existence between life and death. They occupied a social purgatory from which there was no escape, no redemption, and no hope of returning to their former lives. The cruelty was deliberate, calculated to send a message that echoed through every Spartan household. Failure on the battlefield would destroy not just you, but everyone you loved. The Spartan system of punishment wasn't born from chaos or emotion. It was a carefully constructed mechanism of social control, refined over centuries. To understand the full horror these women endured, I need to examine the society that created such elaborate cruelties. Sparta in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE was unlike any other Greek city-state. It was a place where normal rules of civilization had been inverted in service of military supremacy. From birth, every Spartan was evaluated through the lens of warfare. Male infants deemed too weak were left on mountainsides to die. Those who survived faced the agoge, a brutal training system that transformed boys into warriors. But what many forget is that Spartan women were also products of this militaristic ideology. They were raised to be mothers of warriors, trained in athletics to produce strong offspring, and indoctrinated with the belief that their primary purpose was supporting the military state. This context makes the treatment of defeated warriors' wives even more tragic. These women had done everything their society asked of them. They had borne sons for the army, maintained households while their husbands campaigned, and upheld Spartan values of strength and endurance. Yet all of this counted for nothing the moment their husbands failed in battle. The legal framework surrounding these punishments was as sophisticated as it was cruel. Spartan law, largely unwritten but universally understood, contained specific provisions for dealing with the families of cowards and deserters. These weren't vague social customs, but codified practices that magistrates and citizens were obligated to enforce. The public humiliation of defeated warriors' wives followed carefully orchestrated rituals designed to maximize psychological trauma, while serving as cautionary spectacles for the entire community. These ceremonies of shame were as much a part of Spartan religious and civic life as their famous military parades. The first ritual often occurred within hours of the news arriving. The wife would be summoned before the ephors or local magistrates, not to receive condolences, but to be formally stripped of her status. This wasn't a private affair conducted with dignity. It was deliberately public, often held in the agora where the maximum number of citizens could witness the woman's fall from grace. What followed was a grotesque parody of mourning customs. In most Greek societies, widows were afforded specific rites and rituals to grieve their dead. They could wail and tear their clothes in demonstrations of sorrow. But in Sparta, the wives of cowards were forbidden these basic human expressions. To mourn a coward was itself an act of cowardice. Instead, they were forced to maintain composure while their world collapsed around them. Any sign of emotion was punished as weakness. The physical markers of shame were particularly cruel. These women were required to wear specific garments that immediately identified their status to anyone who saw them. Unlike the dignified black robes of honored widows, they wore rough, undyed cloth that resembled slave garments more than free women's clothing. The temporal restrictions created a form of social prison. They were banned from appearing in public during certain hours, typically the busiest times when the agora was full of citizens. When they were permitted out, they had to take specific routes through the city, avoiding main thoroughfares and places of honor. In Sparta's unique system, where land was theoretically held in common but practically controlled by citizens, the wives of defeated warriors often lost access to their kleroi, the land allotments that provided their livelihood. Without land, without status, and without the ability to remarry honorably, these women faced not just social death, but potential physical starvation. The process of economic dismantling began immediately. Ephors would dispatch officials to inventory the household's possessions, a humiliating procedure conducted in full view of neighbors. Every item of value was cataloged: bronze vessels, furniture, stored grain, even personal ornaments. The stated purpose was ensuring that state property wasn't being hidden, but the real intent was demonstrating the family's fall from grace. The helots who worked the land presented a particular problem. These enslaved peoples, who outnumbered Spartan citizens by ratios that some historians estimate at 7-1, were essential for agricultural production. When a warrior was disgraced, the helots attached to his household might be reassigned, leaving his widow without the labor force necessary to work whatever land she was allowed to retain. Financial isolation compounded the economic crisis. In Sparta, as in most ancient societies, economic life was built on networks of reciprocal obligation. The wives of cowards found themselves expelled from these networks. Debts owed to them might go unpaid with impunity. Promises of dowries for their daughters would be withdrawn. Some women were reduced to subsistence strategies that barely distinguished them from beggars. They might glean fields after harvest, hoping to gather enough grain to survive. They would gather wild plants from marginal lands or perform menial services for the Perioeci communities on the edges of Spartan territory. Each activity further marked them as outcasts, their poverty a visible sign of their husband's failure. Perhaps no aspect of Sparta's treatment of defeated warriors' wives was more brutal than the physical violence they endured. This violence was not only tolerated but actively encouraged by the state as part of comprehensive punishment for military failure. The violence began with sanctioned public punishments that blurred the line between judicial penalty and mob brutality. Women whose husbands had shown cowardice might be subjected to public beatings in the agora, administered not by official executioners, but by ordinary citizens. These weren't formal floggings with regulated limits. They were chaotic scenes where crowds were encouraged to participate. The sexual violence these women faced remains one of the darkest chapters in Spartan history. The wives of defeated warriors lost the protection that their status as married women normally provided. They became, in the eyes of many Spartan men, legitimate targets for assault. The logic was perverse but consistent with Spartan ideology. If their husbands had failed to defend Sparta with their bodies, then these women's bodies became forfeit to those who had succeeded. Warriors returning from successful campaigns might claim access to the wives of those who had failed, not through any legal mechanism, but through social custom that made resistance impossible. These women couldn't appeal to authorities who saw such violations as natural consequences of their husbands' cowardice. The physical marking of these women represented another form of violence that left permanent scars. Some accounts describe forced brandings or tattoos that marked them as wives of cowards, visible signs that invited further abuse. Hair cutting, while symbolic in nature, was performed with deliberate brutality, not the ritual shearing of mourning, but violent, degrading attacks that left women bloodied and permanently marked. The children who suffered most profoundly from Sparta's treatment of defeated warriors' families were boys and girls who bore no responsibility for their father's actions, yet found themselves condemned to lives of systematic abuse, discrimination, and psychological torture. From the moment news of their father's cowardice reached Sparta, these children were transformed from promising young citizens into pariahs marked for life. In the Agoge, where Spartan boys were trained from age 7 to become warriors, the sons of cowards faced special torments designed to either break them completely or forge them into warriors who would die rather than repeat their father's shame. The systematic abuse began with isolation. While other boys formed bonds of brotherhood that would sustain them through battles to come, the sons of defeated warriors were deliberately kept apart. They ate alone, slept in the worst quarters, and were excluded from team exercises that built unit cohesion. Physical abuse against these boys exceeded even the notorious harshness of regular Agoge training. While all Spartan boys faced beatings, deprivation, and brutal physical challenges, the sons of cowards endured special torments. They were selected for the most dangerous tasks, given the least food, and subjected to beatings not for any infractions, but simply as reminders of their inherited shame. For daughters, the situation was differently cruel but equally devastating. Spartan girls who normally enjoyed more freedom and education than their counterparts in other Greek cities found themselves excluded from the physical training and social activities that prepared young women for their roles as mothers of warriors. The marriage prospects for these girls were essentially non-existent within normal Spartan society. No self-respecting warrior would risk contaminating his bloodline by marrying the daughter of a coward. These girls faced futures as perpetual spinsters in a society where a woman's value was largely determined by her ability to produce warrior sons. Among the most horrifying aspects of Sparta's treatment of defeated warriors' wives was the systematic manipulation of their marital status, a form of state-sanctioned control that reduced women to breeding stock in service of military ideology. The Spartan state didn't simply abandon these women to their fate. It actively intervened in their most intimate affairs, orchestrating remarriages that served as both punishment and a twisted form of eugenics. The moment a warrior was confirmed dead or disgraced, his wife entered a bureaucratic process that would determine her future with cold efficiency. The Ephyrs maintained detailed records of all marriages, bloodlines, and property holdings. They would review each case, considering factors such as the woman's age, her fertility, her family connections, and most importantly, whether she had already produced sons for the state. Based on this assessment, her fate would be decided not by her own wishes, but by what the state determined would best serve Spartan military interests. For younger women who were still of childbearing age, forced remarriage was almost inevitable. But these weren't marriages in any meaningful sense. They were breeding arrangements designed to erase the genetic stain of cowardice. The state would select new husbands from among warriors who had proven themselves in battle, men who had earned the right to father the next generation of Spartans. The woman's consent was neither sought nor required. She was simply transferred from one household to another like a piece of military equipment. The selection process was deliberately humiliating. Women would be paraded before potential husbands, sometimes in groups, while men evaluated them like livestock at market. These forced unions came with strict conditions that emphasized the woman's degraded status. She entered the new household not as an equal partner but as a subordinate, often with fewer rights than a first wife would normally enjoy. The psychological torture of these arrangements was profound. Many women were forced to marry men who had fought against their first husbands, sometimes men who might have been directly responsible for their deaths. While the dominant historical narrative of ancient Sparta was written by and about its warriors, fragments of evidence survive that allow us to glimpse the experiences of the women who suffered under its cruel system. These voices from the shadows, preserved in legal documents, gravestone inscriptions, and the accounts of foreign observers, paint a detailed picture of human suffering. One of the most poignant sources comes from Xenophon's lesser-known works, where he records encountering a woman he identifies only as the widow of Sphacteria. Her husband had been among the 120 Spartans who surrendered rather than die, and her account provides rare insight into the lived experience of disgrace. She described waking each morning to find new marks of shame painted on her door, walking to the well before dawn to avoid the stares and stones of her neighbors, and watching her teenage son volunteer for what amounted to a suicide mission simply to escape the torment of his daily existence. Archaeological evidence from Spartan burial sites tells its own grim story. The graves of women identified as wives of defeated warriors, marked by specific burial practices and isolated locations, contain objects that speak to lives of deprivation and suffering. Unlike the graves of honored Spartan women, which might contain jewelry, mirrors, and other personal items, these burials are stark, containing only the most basic grave goods. Foreign observers, particularly Athenian writers who had no love for Sparta, occasionally recorded encounters with these ostracized women. One describes seeing a group of them during a religious festival, huddled at the edges of the celebration, wearing rough garments that immediately marked their status. He describes their faces as bearing the kind of emptiness that comes not from hunger of the body but starvation of the soul. The treatment of defeated warriors' wives in Sparta did not exist in a vacuum of unquestioned acceptance. It generated both fierce defense from those who saw it as essential to Spartan supremacy and harsh criticism from those who recognized its fundamental inhumanity. The defenders of the system, primarily found among the Spartan ruling class and their sympathizers, articulated a philosophy that viewed collective punishment as essential to military excellence. When questioned by a foreign diplomat about the treatment of these women, a Spartan king reportedly responded that the bronze of a shield must be pure throughout, for one weak point and the entire defense fails. Religious criticism came from unexpected quarters. Some priests and oracle interpreters suggested that the gods were displeased with the treatment of innocent women and children. They pointed to military defeats and natural disasters as evidence of divine disapproval. The fact that Sparta felt compelled to create elaborate religious justifications for these practices suggests an underlying anxiety about their moral legitimacy. Within Sparta itself, we can detect subtle forms of resistance and criticism, though they were necessarily coded and careful. The phenomenon of Spartan women helping each other in secret, sharing food, providing shelter, protecting children despite severe penalties for aiding the disgraced, suggests that human compassion persisted even under the most oppressive systems. Some Spartan men seemed uncomfortable with the extremes of the practice. Records indicate that certain warriors refused rewards that included access to the wives of defeated enemies, though they could not openly state their objections without facing consequences themselves. The systematic brutalization of defeated warriors' wives in ancient Sparta left scars that extended far beyond individual victims, creating ripple effects that would ultimately contribute to the decline and fall of one of history's most formidable military powers. By the 4th century BCE, the demographic consequences of Sparta's cruel practices had become undeniable. The population of full Spartan citizens had declined catastrophically from perhaps 8,000 adult males at Sparta's height to fewer than 1,000 by the time of its subjugation by Macedon. While multiple factors contributed to this decline, the systematic destruction of families through the punishment of defeated warriors' wives played a significant role. Every family destroyed, every woman prevented from remarrying honorably, every child driven to suicide or exile represented a loss to the already small Spartan citizen body. The system that was supposed to create invincible warriors had instead created a society so brutal that it consumed itself. The psychological effects on the broader population were equally devastating. Living in a society where such cruelty was not only accepted but mandated created a culture of fear and mistrust that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Citizens lived in constant terror that they or their loved ones might be next, that a single moment of weakness or bad luck could destroy everything they had built. This fear paralyzed innovation and adaptation. Sparta became increasingly rigid and inflexible, unable to respond to changing military technologies and political realities. The society that had once been the most advanced military power in Greece became trapped by its own cruelty, unable to evolve or reform. The story of what Spartans did to the wives of defeated warriors carries profound relevance for our modern world. We like to think that such systematic cruelty belongs to the distant past, but the underlying mechanisms that enabled these atrocities, fear, collective punishment, dehumanization of the other, remain disturbingly familiar. In today's world, we see echoes of Spartan logic in how societies sometimes treat the families of those deemed failures or enemies. The practice of punishing not just individuals but their entire families for perceived transgressions appears in various forms across different cultures and political systems. The Spartan experience teaches us that societies that sacrifice their most vulnerable members in pursuit of strength or ideological purity ultimately weaken themselves. The energy spent on maintaining systems of oppression, the talent wasted through exclusion and violence, the fear that paralyzes innovation, all these factors contribute to eventual decline and collapse. Perhaps most importantly, the untold stories of these Spartan women remind us that behind every historical narrative of glory and conquest lie individual human beings who paid the price. Their suffering was not noble or meaningful. It was simply cruel, a waste of human potential that served no purpose beyond satisfying a society's twisted definition of honor. Modern psychological research confirms what these ancient victims experienced: systematic humiliation, social isolation, and the threat of violence create trauma that extends across generations. The children who witnessed their mother's abuse carried that trauma forward, perpetuating cycles of violence and dysfunction that ultimately destroyed the society that created them. Understanding this dark history raises the question of how things might have been handled differently. Sparta could have chosen to separate military failure from moral failure, recognizing that defeat in battle doesn't necessarily indicate cowardice or weakness. They could have created systems for redemption rather than permanent punishment, allowing warriors and their families paths back to respectability. The Spartan obsession with genetic purity and the belief that cowardice was inherited could have been replaced with recognition that courage and character are developed through training, support, and opportunity rather than breeding. Instead of destroying families, Sparta could have invested in rehabilitation and reintegration. Most fundamentally, Sparta could have recognized the basic humanity and individual worth of all its citizens, including women and children who had no control over military outcomes. A society truly committed to strength would have protected its most vulnerable members rather than sacrificing them to abstract ideals. The alternative approaches taken by other Greek city-states provide examples of how military societies could function without resorting to such extreme cruelty. Athens, despite its own flaws and limitations, managed to maintain military competence while allowing for greater individual dignity and social mobility. As I reach the end of this exploration into one of history's cruelest systemic injustices, we're left with a sobering realization. The Spartan system succeeded in one of its goals. It made death in battle seem preferable to survival with dishonor. But in achieving this goal, it created something far worse than military defeat. It created a society so corrupted by its own cruelty that it became incapable of recognizing the humanity of its own members. The wives of defeated warriors, subjected to fates truly worse than death, stand as eternal witnesses to the truth that any society that sacrifices its most vulnerable on the altar of strength will ultimately find itself too weak to survive. The greatest tragedy is not that these women suffered, though their suffering was immense, but that their suffering was rendered meaningless by history. They were not martyrs whose deaths inspired change, not heroes whose resistance sparked revolution. They were simply victims of a system that viewed their pain as necessary, their humanity as expendable, and their voices as unworthy of preservation. In the end, Sparta fell not in glorious battle, but in slow collapse, brought down by the weight of its own cruelty. The empire built on the suffering of innocent women and children could not stand, for no foundation built on such injustice ever can. Today, as we uncover these buried histories and bring these forgotten voices to light, we do more than simply record ancient cruelties. We acknowledge a debt to those who suffered in silence, whose names were erased, whose stories were suppressed. The wives of defeated Spartan warriors deserved better from their society, and they deserve better from history. Their testimony, written in suffering and preserved in fragments, carries a warning that echoes across the centuries. That the true measure of a civilization is not in the glory of its victories, but in how it treats those who have the least power to resist its worst impulses. This untold past history serves as both memorial and warning. Memorial to the countless unnamed women who endured unimaginable suffering with no hope of rescue or redemption. Warning to future generations that the price of allowing cruelty to become systematic, normalized, and institutionalized is the eventual destruction of everything a society claims to value. In studying this dark history, I honor not just the victims but the fundamental human dignity that Sparta tried so hard to destroy. I affirm that every life has value, that suffering matters, and that the stories of the powerless deserve to be told alongside the chronicles of the mighty. This is why I must continue to excavate these untold stories, to ensure that the voices from the shadows are finally heard, and to remember that behind every monument to strength lie the bones of those who paid the price for someone else's glory. The lesson is clear. True strength lies not in the ability to inflict suffering, but in the wisdom to prevent it. True honor comes not from victory at any cost, but from the courage to protect the innocent. And true civilization is measured not by the fear it inspires in its enemies, but by the compassion it shows to its own people, especially those who have no power to demand better treatment. The wives of defeated Spartan warriors teach us that some fates truly are worse than death, but more importantly, they teach us that such fates are choices made by societies, not inevitable consequences of conflict. We have the power to choose differently, to build civilizations based on dignity rather than domination, on protection rather than punishment. Their suffering was meaningless in their own time, but it need not be meaningless in ours if we learn from their pain and resolve never to repeat such systematic cruelty. This is their legacy and our responsibility, to remember, to learn, and to ensure that such darkness never again masquerades as strength, such cruelty never again passes for honor, and such systematic dehumanization never again defines what it means to be civilized. In telling their story, we give meaning to their suffering and purpose to our remembrance. This is how the dead finally find justice, and how the living finally find wisdom. The true victory over Sparta's cruel system comes not from military conquest, but from moral evolution, from the slow, difficult work of building societies that see the humanity in everyone and protect the dignity of all. This is the real triumph that these forgotten women made possible through their suffering, the lesson written in their pain and preserved in their silence. That love is stronger than fear, compassion more enduring than cruelty, and justice more powerful than any army ever assembled. Their voices, silent for millennia, finally speak through our remembrance, carrying across the centuries a message both simple and profound. Every human life matters, every story deserves to be told, and every society bears the responsibility to protect rather than prey upon those who cannot protect themselves. In hearing their voices and heeding their warning, we honor not just their memory but our own humanity, and we build the foundations for civilizations worthy of the name. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most tragic and misunderstood stories. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. I am dedicated to uncovering the hidden, untold stories in history. Ring that notification bell, because the next untold story will move you more than this. Until then, question the narratives, listen to the silenced voices, and never stop seeking the truth behind the legends.